everyone, it's Stacey. Today we're doing our mystery block of the month and we're doing block number 3, and this month it's called the Thrifty Block. Now it's really nice and easy to make. The hardest part is actually working out which pieces of fabric to cut to which size, but I've worked out a really easy way to tell you how to do that, so I'll show you that in just a moment. Don't forget you can find my instructions in the link below and it will take you over to my website, so you can find everything there. And if you remember last month I asked about cutting. What I've decided to do is just show you how I cut, not teach you how I cut. So I will put a link in there if you need to know a little bit more about cutting. But for now, let's make our Thrifty Block. For the Thrifty Block, you're going to need 5 different fabrics, and I've picked out mine and given them all a press. And then I've come up with this diagram that explains exactly what size to cut each of the pieces to make up the block. So the first piece here is the middle square, and we need to cut one 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch square. Then we're doing the purple, so the 4 purple outer squares, we need to cut 4 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch squares. Then for the outer corners, there are 4 squares inside each corner. What we're going to do is we are going to cut strips again, sew them together and then cut them. And the reason why I like to do this is because I think it's quicker. We save time on the cutting, the sewing, and I think it turns out more accurate. However, you do have to be careful if you're using directional fabric because some will end up the wrong way, so just keep an eye on that. So for the yellow fabric, we've got 2 here in each of the squares. We need to cut 2 2.5 inch by 10 inch pieces. Then for each of the pink and the green, we're going to cut 1 2.5 inch by 10 inch piece. Now this diagram is over on my website and there'll be a link in the description below to find it. So I've got my little graph here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work through the list and cut out my fabric. And I'm not going to show you, or rather teach you how to cut the fabric, I'm just going to show you how I'm going to do it. So for the first piece I need a 4.5 inch square. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to line it up on 0 and cut at 4.5 inches. Actually, I'm just going to use my ruler. 1, 2, 3, 4.5. And I did go through all my scraps and I just checked if I had anything that would work first, like the scraps in the fabric that I've chosen to use. And if there's anything there, let's use that up. And if you do need a little bit of help with cutting, I'll put a link above with a detailed video on how to cut fabric. So 1, 2, 3, 4.5. Okay, so I'll save that piece. I'll just put everything back together. Save that for next time, and now I've got my first piece. Next, I'm going to cut the 4 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch squares. So next I'm going to cut the piece that's going to be in the outer squares where I've got 2 pieces of the same colour. So I need to cut 2 2.5 inch by 10 inch strips. And then I'm going to cut the last 2 pieces, which are both 2.5 inches by 10 inches. And I've got this piece here that I'm just going to cut down to size. So do make sure you go through all your pieces and use up what you can. So now I've cut out all my pieces. Remember to keep all the little bits that are left over because we may be able to use them in the upcoming blocks. So now let's get sewing. We're going to start off by sewing the corners. So we're going to take one C fabric and sew it to the D fabric, and then taking another C fabric and sewing it to the E fabric. So this cream fabric is my C fabric, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take one of each of these strips, face them right sides together, and then we'll line up all those edges on the sides and along the top, and I will pop a few pins in. Just checking all those edges are lined up nicely. And then I'm just going to sew along that edge, and I'll do the same for this piece so I can sew them both at the same time. Okay, let's sew them together. So before I begin sewing, we need a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've got my 1/4 inch foot on, and I have moved my needle over just a smidge so I get a really nice 1/4 inch. Sometimes I find it's a bit too generous if I just leave the needle where it sits naturally. And then I've checked my stitches that my sewing machine's stitching nicely. I'm stitching at stitch length 2, and I'm using my Aurifil thread and my bobbin's full, so I'm ready to go. So I'm going to start at the very beginning, right before actually the fabric, and then sew right to the very end. We're not worrying about a back stitch. Come right off the edge. Just going to trim my thread, and I'm going to trim it at the top while we're here. And then I'm just going to do exactly the same for the second piece. Now let's just give those two a quick press. So I'm just going to set the stitches, and like the name suggests, that just helps the stitches set in, which makes them extra strong and helps them lay nice and flat. Open it up, and I'm pressing the seams towards the dark. Finger pressing it. We don't want any creases in here. We want it to sit nice and flat, and then giving it a press. And then I'll repeat that for the second piece. Now we're going to cut them. Now what we're going to do is take each of the pieces that we sewed together, and we're going to cut them into 2.5 inch strips. So we'll end up with 4 pieces from each of the 2 different colorways. So I'm just going to take my ruler, find 2.5 inches on my ruler, line up 2.5 inches on the edge, line up a line on the seam of my sewing, and then also check that it's lining up at the bottom here, and that looks perfect to me. So then I'm just going to cut. Then I'll just take that one away, cut the next 2.5 inch strip, and then sew on until I have 4 pieces. So now I've got 4 pieces in that colorway. I'm just going to take my second piece and do exactly the same thing. So now I've got my 2.5 inch pieces that we just cut. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to spin this one around so that when we marry them up, we're creating that checkerboard effect. I've got the 2 fabrics that match in either corner, on the bottom left and the top right, and then the 2 different fabrics on the top left and the bottom right. So I'm just going to take these 2, I'm going to fold them right sides together, and then I'm going to come along and just check that those seams are nested. Remember, we've got 1 seam coming around and going that way, 1 seam coming around and going this way, which means we can nest those seams. And I've got a video on that if you'd like to check it. But I'm just going to open that up and check that they are sitting nicely. And when I'm happy, I'm just going to pop a pin in. And if you'd like, you could pop one at the end, and sorry, at the beginning and the end. I'm not going to worry about it. I can correct that as I'm sewing. And I'm going to do that for all 4 sets. So now I'm just going to sew along the edge, and I'm just going to make sure that they're all lined up nicely. And if you'd like to, you could pop a pin in to make sure they stay in place. I'm just starting right at the edge, not worrying about a back stitch. And then coming right off the edge again. just going to trim the thread while I'm here, and I'll repeat that for all 4 pieces. Okay, now let's press all 4 pieces. So for all 4 pieces, I'll just set the seams again. Open it up, and it doesn't matter which way the seams face. Give it a finger press and press. Just give the whole thing a little press, and I'll repeat that for all 4 pieces. Okay, now let's lay out all our pieces. So now I'm going to lay out all the pieces so they match the pattern. So I've got my peach that's going in the center. Then I've got my other squares, and they're all going on each side of the square. And then I've got my corner pieces. So I need to decide which color I want on the outer edge so I could have them. So I've got my peach in the center here with the mint color on the edge, or I might want to put them this way. I actually think I prefer it that way, so that's what I'm going to do. So I've got the peach on the corner, of all of them. So now what we're going to do is sew the rows together. So I'll start with this bottom one. So now I'm just going to fold this one on top, lining up those edges. We've got the right sides together, and I'll pin it. And actually I'm just going to do it roughly, and then when we come to it, I'll fix them up. Just making sure we don't accidentally mix up the order. And then taking the last set. Now let's sew them together. So taking one of my rows, I'm just going to take the pin out, open it up, and just line up all the edges really nicely, making sure the side, the top, and this side are all lined up. Then I'll pop my pin back in and sew along. I'm not going to worry about the back stitch. Just starting at the very beginning, remembering to make sure that these seams, if they're pressed away from you, make sure that they stay that way when you sew over them, so that our block's going to sit really nicely. Coming right off the edge. Trimming the threads, and I'm going to repeat that for the second piece on the row, and then I'll repeat that for all 3 rows. Okay, now let's press. So just making sure that the pieces are in the right order again, I'm just going to take the top row. I'm going to set the seams on the 2 seams we just sewed. And then I'm going to press the seams in towards the big square. So just making sure they're sitting correctly, finger pressing and pressing. And doing the same on this side, facing those seams in towards the big square. You can give the whole thing a quick press. Sorry, the whole piece. Quick press. Taking the middle row and again setting those seams. And then this time we're going to press the seams out towards the outer edge. Finger pressing and pressing, just giving the whole piece a nice press. And the last piece, we're going to press the seams in towards the center again. So setting the seams. Opening it up and just making sure the seams are facing in towards the bigger square. Giving the whole piece a quick press. Now let's finish it off. So just checking you've got your pieces in the correct order, and I know I have because I've got my peach fabric in the top corners and in the bottom corners. We're just going to sew them together now, so I'm going to take the top piece and fold it down onto the middle piece. And I'm going to nest the seams where I can. So I'm just opening it up, marrying them up there, lining up these edges here, popping a pin in. And doing the same on the other nested seam. And then I'll just open that up and I'm going to fold this piece on top and match up those seams again. If you're new to nesting seams, you might like to pin on both sides, and you might like to add in a few extra pins. And now we'll just sew along those last two seams. So now I'm just going to sew along the edges. I'm just going to make sure before I start that the edges are lined up nicely, and like I said, you might feel more comfortable with popping in a few pins. You can see here I'm coming up to the bottom and it's not lined up, so I'll just fix that as I go. And now I'm just going to do exactly the same for this other seam. Okay, now let's give it one last press. So now I'm just going to set the seams. And I'm going to press them in towards the larger piece here because that's just how they naturally want to go. Just give it a finger press. And doing the same on the bottom seam. And now let's give our whole block a quick press. And there we have it, the Thrifty Block. I really like it. I think it's very simple, but very effective. So I hope you like making the Thrifty Block with me. I really like it. I think it's really nice, simple and effective. Now I do have a question for you, and I really need you to write an answer in the comments for me so I know what your preference is. If we keep going the way we're going, we're actually going to finish the mystery block of the month in December. But I did have a member message me saying that they would have liked to have finished it before Christmas. So I was wondering if in July I should do 2 block of the months, just so we'll be finishing in November. So if that would be your preference to finish this series in November, please let me know in the comments, or if you'd rather just carrying on and just doing it so we end in December, then also let me know, whichever way you prefer. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe and leave a comment.